Hi there, and welcome to Mickerman's RCT Station. In this video, we're going to go through 10 tips for pay-for-entry scenarios in RollerCoaster Tycoon. Pay-for-entry scenarios were introduced in RCT2, and are parks where the cost of all rides are fixed at free. They're generally seen as a bit more challenging than pay-for-ride scenarios because guest rate of spending, and hence your rate of income per guest, is quite slow after they've paid the one-off cost of the entry fee. This graph here gives you an idea of different rates of guest spending in pay-for-entry compared to that of pay-for-ride. Once a guest pays the entry fee, they can only spend money on food, drink, and souvenirs, which are generally much less expensive and purchased less frequently than ride tickets. Whilst pay-for-entry parks certainly have their challenges, I'm hoping to show you some tactics that make the most of the restrictions and make you look forward to these sort of parks rather than dread them. These tips are in no particular order and have helped me a lot in these sorts of scenarios in the past. They apply to the 2D isometric versions of the game, including the original RCT 1 and 2, RCT Classic, and OpenRCT2. With all that out of the way, let's get into it. Before jumping into the first tip, it's worth defining a term that will be coming up a few times throughout the video, the soft guest cap. You can almost think of this as the number of guests your park has capacity for. Each ride type, shop, and stall, when opened, contributes a certain value to this soft guest cap for your park. For the majority of scenarios, the total soft guest cap is a simple summation of all of these values from each ride and attraction, with the exception of a very small number of scenarios with harder guest generation enabled. When you have a higher number of guests in your park than the soft guest cap, guest generation slows down quite significantly, and usually results in your guest count hitting a point of equilibrium, usually at or around the same number as this soft guest cap. In general, more rides and attractions means a higher soft guest cap, which means more guests naturally attracted to your park. Marcel Vos has a fantastic video on guest spawning in RCT2, including a discussion on how the soft guest cap works. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Now on to tip number 1. Think of guests differently than you would in pay-for-ride parks. With pay-for-ride parks, you generally don't mind guests staying as long as possible, using ATMs and spending insane amounts of money fast. With pay-for-entry, it's worth changing your mindset from keeping the guests in the park for as long as possible to actually increasing the guest turnover, as guests staying forever in your park doesn't do much for you in terms of generating revenue. It can be better, from a financial standpoint, to let them go, especially if your guest count is above the soft guest cap. If you've reached the soft guest cap, guest generation slows down, meaning your entry fee income will too. Therefore, guests leaving in this case will be doing you a favour financially, as they'll eventually be replaced with new guests that pay the entry fee. One caveat to this mindset of higher guest turnover is its conflict with minimum guest goal objectives. With this in mind, once your park can comfortably support the number of guests needed for the goal and you're approaching the scenario deadline, it's probably wise to try to keep guests in the park as opposed to getting them to leave as quickly as possible. Number 2. Limit the entry fee to the minimum amount that guests spawn with for that scenario. In each scenario with money enabled, guests spawn with a quantity of money within a predefined range that has a minimum and maximum value. If you use dollars as your currency, these minimum and maximum values are separated by $30. For example, in Forest Frontiers, guests spawn with between $60 and $90, whereas in Thunder Rock, it's between $40 and $70. Selecting a handful of guests at random and checking their cash amounts will show you what the minimum and maximum amounts guests spawn with in that scenario. Charging a higher entry fee than the minimum amount the guests spawn with means that many guests won't be able to enter your park. If you're playing a scenario or version of RCT where ATMs aren't available, and you're behind the 8 ball on a minimum guest goal objective, consider lowering the entry fee a further $5 to $10 below this minimum amount. Otherwise, guests will leave the park almost immediately after entering because they have no funds left. Yeah, RCT guests aren't the brightest. Before you go straight to the highest practical entry fee for the scenario, you'll need to have a decent number of rides in your park. Otherwise, guest generation will slow down quite a bit, which I'll touch on again later. Number 3. Go hard early. Building as many rides as you can early enables you to set the highest practicable entry price sooner, hence extracting the largest possible amount of money from more of your guests. You'll also be surprised at how early you can start charging rather high entry prices too. All it seems to take is 4 to 5 gentle or thrill rides, and 2 to 3 coasters, and you're pretty much able to charge around the $40 to $50 mark. The sooner you do this, the faster you'll draw money from more of your guests, if that makes sense. Looking at a similar graph to the one earlier, we can see the difference in guest spend rates between the $20 and $50 entry fee. The $20 entry fee means that guests take a lot longer to spend the remainder of their money. Number 4. Pay attention to guests commenting your park entrance fee is cheap. This one might seem pretty obvious, but I still think it's worth mentioning. Not increasing the price after you see this message means you're missing out on some very easy and potentially crucial cash flow. It should be noted that this message appears to only show up in the original RCT and RCT Deluxe. In RCT2 and RCT Classic, you'll likely win the Best Value Park Award, which is basically telling you the same thing as the message in the original RCT. When either of these occur in a pay-for-entry park, you can actually charge up to double your current entry fee without slowing down guest generation. On the contrary, where you're charging too much for the entrance fee, you may get the message suggesting to lower it, and guest generation will also slow down significantly. Keep in mind that this message only occurs when you're charging more than 50% the amount you should be based on your attractions. So if your guest generation is still slow despite not receiving this message, it still may be because you're charging too much for your entrance fee. Number 5. Consider not using ATMs. This one might seem a bit controversial, and this can be dependent on the situation that you're in. If you're short on cash, you're better off leaving guests with no money to leave the park and respawn, and getting a new guest paying an entry fee. Guests that refill their cash at an ATM will take far longer to spend the equivalent amount on food, drink, souvenirs as a single entry fee from a new guest. If you think you're fine for money in the long term, and you've got a minimum guest goal objective, then go ahead and use a couple ATMs, as you probably want to focus more on keeping the guests you have in the park. Number 6. Build small coasters instead of large ones. This is a great tip that Marcel Vos had in his 42 gameplay tips and tricks video. And while that video was targeted towards general scenario play, this tip holds especially true for pay-for-entry scenarios. The soft guest cap is really only influenced by the number and type of rides in your park, as opposed to their size and stats. This is something to keep in mind particularly for roller coasters, as they're generally the most expensive rides in the game. So this classic shuttle loop, for example, attracts the same amount of guests to your park as a pre-built ride Fizzly, which is almost 8 times the cost. Higher ride stats will increase the maximum practical park entrance fee a little, but it's still generally a more efficient use of money to invest in smaller coasters. The exception to this is for harder guest generation scenarios, where longer coasters, that's 600 meters in length or above, are required to attract more guests past a given threshold. I'm by no means advocating spamming microcoasters everywhere, as I don't think that's a very interesting way of playing the game. But there are plenty of sensible smaller coaster layout ideas you can use in these sort of parks, but still do the job of keeping guests entertained for less cost. Number 7. Don't go overboard on shops and stalls. Given that revenue from shops and stall sales are probably the most consistent source of income in pay-for-entry scenarios, other than the park entrance tickets, it might be tempting to place a lot of extra shops and stalls than you might usually. However, consistent money here doesn't really mean a lot of money, as the profit margins of shops and stalls are generally very low. Also, the cost of building shops and stalls can add up deceptively quickly. Even 2 or 3 shops and stalls can easily cover the cost of a decent flat ride. Most flat rides also attract a lot more guests, and hence potential entry fee income for your park. This is great both in terms of attracting guests, if your objective is a certain guest count, but maybe more importantly for revenue in the long run. Shops, stalls and facilities are still pretty crucial for a successful park though, so don't neglect them, which leads into the next tip. Spend more time micromanaging the cost of items of shops and stalls. It can be worth increasing the cost of items of your shops and stalls a little bit. Generally speaking, I found you can increase the cost of items by about 20 or 30 cents at most stalls, but keep your eye out for guests saying they won't pay that much when you do play around with the cost of items. I'll put a link to Marcel Vos's video on shops and stalls pricing in the description below for more detail. The $20 umbrella trick when it's raining can be a very useful tactic when you're in a bit of a financial pinch, so much so that this could almost be a separate tip on its own. Number 9. Use your on-ride photo sections. A deceptively handy source of income, especially on higher throughput rides. You don't even need to be a pro coaster designer to put one in. You can simply delete one tile of a straight and level track from a pre-built design and replace it with the on-ride photo section. Please note, however, that not all coaster types offer on-ride photo sections, but many water rides in RCT2 and RCT Classic, like the log flume and splash boats, do. This was, perhaps unsurprisingly, another topic Marcel Vos explored in detail, and he found that the optimum price for on-ride photos was around $3. Here's an example of a medium throughput coaster with an on-ride photo section that I built early on in Canary Mines. By the end of October Year 3, it had made just over $3,000. Not a massive amount, but a pretty handy contribution for a single ride. And now onto the final tip, advertising. Perhaps one of the more overpowered features of the game are marketing campaigns. Although they might seem on the pricey side at first glance, they're generally well worth it. Keep in mind though that they can boost your guest count well past the soft guest cap, as guest generation due to advertising ignores the soft guest cap. If you advertise a lot, then suddenly stop, you'll likely notice a steep drop off in guests soon afterwards, as the guest count falls back to that equilibrium position that we talked about earlier. I sometimes think of advertising campaigns as a caffeine boost to your guest count. To get the most bang for your buck, I'd suggest purchasing advertising campaigns only when your park entry fee is set to the highest practical for the park. Something to note here is that the free entry and half price entry campaigns are only effective if your entrance fee is at least $6. One last thing. Considerations for parks where you can charge for both the entry and the rides. Something I originally neglected upon drafting this video was a discussion on parks that enable you to charge for the entry and the rides. This capability is unique to the RCT base game scenarios, the Corkscrew Follies Added Attractions scenario pack list, and OpenRCT2. Although it seems tempting at first, things get a little more complicated when you charge for both the entry fee and ride tickets, and requires a lot more micromanagement in the long run. If you charge an entry fee, guests are only willing to pay a quarter the amount for rides compared to if entry was free, irrespective of how much the entry fee actually is. Charging for rides also reduces the amount you can charge for the entry fee without guest generation slowing down. I haven't done a huge amount of research to determine what the optimal way to go is here, but my recommendation for these parks is to go with one or the other to make things more straightforward. Either go with pay for ride or pay for entry. And there were my 10 tips for pay for entry scenarios in RollerCoaster Tycoon. A big thanks to Marcel Vos for his work, and also providing me some valuable feedback for this video. As well as these tips here, I'd also like to suggest my 8 tips for scenario play video, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. These tips are intended for general scenario play, but are still definitely applicable to these pay for entry parks. If you have any additional tips or suggestions yourself, feel free to share them in the comments below. I'm sure I've missed a few good ideas and would love to hear some more. As always, thanks for watching and hopefully see you next time.